Hello again. Let's continue our discussion of muscle contraction and hopefully we can finish this chapter. The first thing that I like to add here is to go through this cycle from A to E, we need only one ATP. The second thing is from A to E is called one cycle of cross-bridging. Let's take a look at this muscle fiber. This is one cell. We mentioned a few minutes ago that the action potential is going to come in and is going to propagate on the cell membrane until it's going to get to T-tubule and release calcium. In this part of the picture, you can see the action potential of the neuron. The resting membrane potential is minus 70. If you remember, it's going to go up to plus 30. It's going to come down. It's going to go back to normal. So first action potential is going to happen inside the neuron. And then the change of membrane potential is going to happen in the muscle fiber inside the cell. The resting membrane potential for a skeletal muscle is around minus 90, and the sodium is going to come in. The voltage inside the cell goes up toward 30, and then sodium channel is going to close and is going to go back to normal. After the depolarization happens inside the muscle cell, change of membrane potential is going to reach to the T-tubule and release the calcium. As a result, muscle is going to go to contraction. And then later, you're going to take the calcium out and muscle is going to relax. You realize that before this muscle goes to contraction, we have to release calcium. And to release calcium, we have to change of membrane potential inside the skeletal muscle. So a skeletal muscle first is going to depolarize, and then muscle is going to go to contraction. This period of time that the skeletal muscle is not contracting, but the change of membrane potential is happening and is making it ready to release calcium is called latent period. So let me repeat one more time. The muscle cell still is in a relaxed status, is not in contraction yet. Change of membrane potential is propagating inside the muscle cell, but calcium is not released yet. During this time, we call it latent period. Latent period is a time that the cell membrane is depolarizing, but yet calcium is not released to create contraction. After calcium is released, contraction is going to happen. And we said there's a calcium pump that removes the calcium, and therefore the muscle is going to go to relaxation. Remember, the calcium pump is going to start working as soon as calcium is released. The idea of one contraction and one relaxation of the skeletal muscle cell is called a twitch. This diagram here shows a twitch. Realize the action potential is very short, is around 2 milliseconds, but the twitch is pretty long process, between 10 to 100 milliseconds. The calcium is going to release, and then the calcium will be brought back inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's the important point, that the twitch is much longer than change of membrane potential inside the muscle fiber. The word graded contraction simply means if you stimulate a muscle stronger, you release more calcium, and more calcium is going to recruit more muscle fibers, more actin and myosin, they're going to attach to each other, and as a result is going to create a stronger contraction. This idea of higher release of calcium inside the cell recruits more actin and myosin is called graded contraction. This diagram also shows the action potential of the neuron and simultaneously change of membrane potential of the muscle cell before muscle is going to go to contraction. There's a delay between the action potential and muscle contraction. That delay is called latent period. Make sure you realize that action potential is completed before the contraction of the muscle starts. Also realize that a single action potential of a neuron can release a small and fixed amount of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum. I'm going to repeat one more time. One action potential can release only a fixed amount of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum. If you want to release more, the best idea is increase the number of action potential. In other words, if you, instead of one action potential, you send more than 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, that is going to guarantee more release of calcium. Why? Because by sending more action potential, the calcium pump does not get a chance to remove calcium from the cytoplasm. As a result, calcium is going to stay inside the cytoplasm and cause cross-bridging cycles. If you release only one action potential, you release only a small amount of calcium, and then after that, calcium pump is going to take this calcium back inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum and contraction stops. So therefore, the best strategy to make sure the calcium is going to stay inside the cell and contraction continues is by sending more action potential. And that is possible because before even muscle contraction starts, we have latent period, and that allows us to send more action potential even before this contraction starts. Even after contraction starts, remember, this twitch is going to be between 10 to 100 milliseconds, but the action potential is only 2 milliseconds. In other words, we can have multiple action potential before even relaxation starts. The idea I just mentioned, it shows in this picture. You can see there's a stimulus here. You can see there's a muscle twitch. I can send a second or third or fourth stimulation during the time that muscle is under twitch. As a result, as you can see in this picture, even if I send a second action potential while the muscle is in the relaxation phase, but is not completed yet, you can add more calcium. As a result, the contraction for the second time would be stronger than the first one because you didn't recall all the calcium. Let me give you an example. Let's say every time you stimulate the muscle cell, you release 1,000 calcium. So the 1,000 calcium is released here. During the relaxation, when the calcium pump starts functioning, you have to take this 1,000 calcium back inside the cell. Let's assume that you took 800 calcium back in, but 200 still is inside the cell. By sending a second stimulation, you're releasing another 1,000. Now you have 1,200 calcium inside the cell. So you expect your contraction for the next round would be even stronger. This idea is called summation. So don't forget that we can have an action potential even during a mechanical event, and that still increase the calcium inside the cell. This picture here shows different twitch. This arrowhead shows when you stimulate. In this case, you stimulate once, muscle go into contraction and then relax. After relaxation is completed, you're gonna send a second stimulation. Again, you're gonna have another contraction and relaxation. Again, after this relaxation is completed, you're going to send the third one. So you're going to have 3 different twitch. However, if you bring this stimulation closer before the muscle is fully relaxed, although it's slightly relaxed, but still there's some calcium inside the cell, the second stimulation is going to create a higher contraction because you're adding more calcium inside the cytoplasm. This idea, as we said, is called summation. If you send multiple stimulation, so you're going to add more and more calcium to the cell until all the actin and myosin that are being recruited. At that moment, you get to the maximum amount of tension that you can create inside the cell. Tetanus, by definition, is the maximum amount of tension that you can create. Let's say this is the maximum tension. If you stimulate this muscle multiple times, however, the stimulation is during partial relaxation of the muscle. Although every time you release calcium, you're recruiting all the actin and myosin, but you're going to create a partial relaxation in between each contraction. Since contraction is to the maximum, it's called unfused tetanus. Tetanus happens when you recruit all the actin and myosin that is available inside the muscle cell. However, in this case, it's called unfused because every contraction is going to proceed with a partial relaxation. However, if you bring this stimulation close enough that the muscle doesn't get a chance to relax at all, you're going to reach to the maximum but without any relaxation or break. That is called fused tetanus. So realize fused tetanus and unfused tetanus are different in a sense that fused tetanus does not allow any relaxation, but unfused tetanus, there are going to be some relaxation in between. Let's talk about isometric contraction. The word contraction, we said before, simply means the head of the myosin is going to attach to actin. Isometric simply means iso equal metric length, contraction with the same length. So if you contract a muscle with the same length, it's called isometric contraction. Let's say I'm going to attach this muscle, which is relaxed right now, to this surface and this surface. If I stimulate this muscle, the muscle is going to go to contraction, but of course it's not going to get shorter. This type of contraction is called isometric contraction. If you take a look at this picture here. Let's say there's a load here that is very heavy and you cannot pull it up. You're going to put pressure against this load. Your muscle is going to be in contraction, but you cannot make your muscle shorter, because if you make it shorter, that means you have to pull this bar up. Isometric contraction is a contraction that happens with the same length. There's a term that I want you to know, and that is called preload. Preload is a length of the muscle before muscle go to contraction. So in this scenario, this length is called a preload, or in this scenario, this length is preload. Preload is a length of muscle before muscle goes to contraction. Therefore, we would say isometric contraction is measured when the preload is held constant. Then we're going to stimulate the muscle and measure how much tension this muscle can create. On the other hand, we have something that's called isotonic contraction. Again, it's a contraction with the same tonicity or the same force. For this one, we're going to attach this muscle to only one surface, and the other end of the muscle is attached to a load. This load can be any different load. It can be 5 kilogram, 10 kilogram, 20 kilogram. It doesn't matter. After we stimulate the muscle, if muscle is able to pull up this weight, this cannot be isometric contraction because the length of the muscle is changing. We call this an isotonic contraction because if you ignore gravity, this muscle only should create 20 kilogram of force to pull this load up. There is no need for this muscle to create 30 kilogram of force. There is no need for this muscle to create 40 kilogram of force. Only we need to create 20 kilogram of force to be able to pull this load up. Therefore, during this contraction, the amount of force inside the muscle is going to stay constant, and therefore we call this one isotonic contraction. In this type of contraction, we are dealing with another term, and that is called afterload. Afterload refers to the load or resistance this muscle needs to overcome. So this load, this 20 kilogram, is called afterload. To measure isotonic contraction, we keep the afterload constant, and we're going to contract the muscle, and we measure the shortening of the muscle. Let's talk about length-tension relationship. What does that mean? Let's say this is the sarcomere when the muscle is relaxed. A length of sarcomere in every muscle that we have is relatively fixed. The length of sarcomere in our muscles, in our body, I'm talking about the skeletal muscle, is somewhere between 2 to 2.5 micrometer. In this length, in the length of 2 to 2.5, every head of the myosin is aligned with one actin. The alignment is perfect between the head of the myosin and actin, and as a result, if you stimulate this muscle in this length, you're going to create the maximum amount of tension because every head of the myosin can connect to one actin, and that is called a length of optimum. As you can see in this diagram, this is the percentage of the length of the muscle when the muscle is at rest, and this is the amount of tension. When you have 100% of the length, in other words, when the sarcomere is in normal length, which we said is about 2 micrometer, the amount of tension is maximum. If you stretch this sarcomere beyond 2.5, let's say you're going to go all the way to 3.65. At this point, at 3.65, there is no attachment between head of the myosin and actin. And as a result, as you can see in this picture, the amount of force that you generate is 0, because if the actin cannot attach to myosin, there is no force will be generated. If I decrease the length of sarcomere below 2.0 micrometer, clearly the force also is going to decrease, because as you decrease the length, you're staying away from length of optimum, where all the actin and myosin can be used to generate force. As you can see, for instance, this picture, at this moment, some of the actin are overlapping the other actin. As a result, they are not being used. As a result, as you decrease the length below 2.0 micrometer, the amount of force you generate is going to get also low. The lowest length, the shortest length that we can get is, we said, is a length of your thick filament, which at that point you create some force. So that create something that's called a length-tension relationship. In this experiment, the amount of tension is determined when a muscle goes under an isometric contraction. When the head of the myosin attached to actin, that is considered as an active tension. If I stretch a muscle, let's say we're going to stretch it from this point all the way to 3.65, as you can see in this picture. Remember, we said inside the skeletal muscle we have some elastic fibers. When you pull a rubber, when you stretch a rubber, you're going to create some force inside the rubber that try to collapse the rubber. You pull it and you let it go, the rubber is going to collapse. That force inside the rubber due to stretching of the rubber is called passive tension. Your muscle has some elastic fibers, so therefore your muscle is just like a rubber. When you pull a muscle, you are putting tension against the elastic fiber. Elastic fiber inside the muscle try to collapse. That type of tension that is created inside the muscle due to stretching of the muscle is called passive tension. Passive tension is the result of stretching the muscle, and the significant elastic fiber that we mentioned before was titin. Now, if you add active tension with passive tension, that is called a total tension. If I stretch this muscle, let's say to 3.0 micrometers, somewhere around here, and then if I stimulate this muscle, I can create some force, which is active tension, and if I add the force caused by passive tension through the stretching of the muscle, this together is called total tension. This diagram shows the idea of passive tension, active tension, and total tension. So let's take a look at this one. Remember, when the muscle is at rest, it's in the perfect alignment. If I stimulate this muscle, I'm going to create the maximum tension. Look at the dashes line here, these yellow dashes. That means I'm going to create the maximum tension here. If I stretch this muscle from the resting length, the length of the muscle is going to increase and the tension inside the muscle goes up because you are stretching the muscle and titin or elastic fiber is under stress. So therefore your passive tension is going to go up. However, as you stretch, your active tension is going to drop because as you stretch, you are putting this alignment into jeopardy. In other words, actin and myosin, they are not aligned optimally, and as a result, they cannot contract and create the maximum force. So realize by increasing the length, the passive tension increase, but active tension decrease. The combination of these two is going to create total tension. The total tension at the beginning only is going to follow the active tension until we get to the resting length. At the resting length, as you increase the passive tension and you decrease the active tension, you're going to have a small dip because your active tension is dropping. But after that, the total tension is going to follow the passive tension because when the active tension gets close to zero, the only tension you can have inside the muscle is passive tension. Let's now talk about the relationship between force and speed of shortening, or it's called velocity. This relationship is being studied during isotonic contraction as opposed to length tension relationship that is measured and studied during the isometric contraction. In this experiment, we want to find out the speed of shortening when the afterload, when the load is changing. The speed of shortening depends on how fast your muscle can cycle the cross bridge, can go through those cycles that we talked about in the previous recording. And the speed of cycling depends on how fast the head of the myosin can break down ATP. So one of the factors that determines the speed of shortening is the speed of head of the myosin to break down ATP, or ATPase activity of the head of the myosin. Clearly, if you have a very heavy load, speed of shortening would be much slower than if you have no load and you try to contract your muscle without any resistance. So therefore, at that point, we're going to get to the V maximum. In this diagram, you start from the point that the load is very heavy. At this moment, we are dealing with isometric contraction because muscle is not getting shorter. However, if you decrease the load, or better, if you decrease afterload, then the muscle can go to contraction. And as you decrease the load, as you can see, the speed of shortening will increase. In this diagram, if you compare curve A to the B, you can realize that the muscle that generates curve A is stronger because can move a load that muscle B cannot. For instance, in this load here, yes, muscle A can move it, but muscle B for sure cannot. Therefore, muscle A is stronger than muscle B. That means has more actin and myosin. And also, muscle A has a faster velocity. In this diagram, however, you can see three different types of muscles, A, B, and C. All three of them, they have the same V maximum. Muscle C may move a heavier load versus B, and B is going to move the heavier load versus A. The best explanation here would be these three muscles belongs to one person, but one is stronger than the other one. Let's say muscle C is a quadriceps, muscle B is a triceps, and muscle A is biceps. And finally, in this diagram, you can see that both of these two muscles, A and B, it seems like they have the same strength. However, muscle A is faster in shortening than muscle B, and that probably can be explained by having different ATPase activity. Therefore, I would say muscle A and B probably they belong to two different people with two different ATPase activity. Now, after discussion about isometric and isotonic contraction, let's see what's the strength of the muscle depends on. The strength of the muscle is not only depends on how many actin and myosin you have. Yes, that is important. The number of the actin myosin is important indicator of the amount of force you can create. However, that is not the only factor. The frequency of a stimulation also plays a very important role. I mentioned a few minutes ago, the more action potential you send, the more calcium you're going to release inside the cell. As a result, you can continue your contraction. So frequency of a stimulation also play a very important and crucial role on the strength of contraction. The thickness of the muscle comes from the number of the myofibril you have. The more myofibril you have in every cell, that means your muscle is thicker. That is exactly what happens when you go to a gym and you do exercise. By exercising, you're increasing the number of the myofibril by adding more actin and myosin. However, remember, the number of the cell does not change. If genetically someone is born with more number of the cells in his muscle, let's say if I'm born with 5,000 cells in my biceps and you are born with 10,000 cells in your biceps, you definitely generate twice as much force than I do. Therefore, not only the number of the actin myosin is important, but the number of the cells that you begin with would be important and crucial factor in amount of force that you can generate. And finally, as you mentioned, the initial length of muscle fiber is important. That's why athletes, they always before and after their exercise, they do a stretching because they want to keep the length of the muscle in the optimal length. After years of using your muscle, the alignments between actin and myosin would not be perfect. If they are not perfectly situated, that can decrease the amount of force you can create. As a result, stretching and keeping alignment of all these proteins in place would be so important to generate more force. Therefore, the stronger people, they are not people who have a bulkier muscle.